Going live here with the broadcast right now.
There we go.
Yeah, people are filing in, Victor. Hang on, you can see it on participants.
Yeah. Hello, folks. We're just waiting for everyone to log in. We're up to about 100 participants so far. We expect another 100 to 150. So hang in there with us. Our rate of climb is slowing. I'll give it another minute and then we'll jump in. Are you two professors easygoing for people who show up late for class, or are you the lock the door and don't let them in type?
Well, you got to leave the door open, but you can always shame them on the way in.
All right. Well, I was an economics major, and Reggie Smith, who was a legendary accounting professor, used to shame me regularly when I came in with wet hair and late for an 8:30 class. So. All right, well, our rate of climbing has slowed down here. So why don't we jump in and start, and people will catch up as we go along. I'm sure that there'll be a lot of questions that you folks are addressing. So welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Shanahan, president of the Holy Cross Alumni Association, and we're very happy to have a nice crowd this evening for this presentation on COVID-19 and the sports industry, the way forward. We're pleased to have Dr. Rob Baumann, the chair of the Economics and Accounting Department, and Dr. Victor Matheson, the professor in Economics and Accounting Department. Dr. Baumann is a Ph.D. from Ohio State. I think he may be the only Ohio State graduate to be a Tom Brady fan, but I'm not sure. There's not a lot of you out there. But Rob teaches econometrics, statistics, macroeconomics, and his research interests are in sports economics, real estate, labor, tourism, lots of statistical analysis to support, either business decisions, or I think it looks to me from his research, looking backward at decisions that other people have made to, back test them. He and Victor are both very widely published in the academic world, and regularly quoted and interviewed in media and online in issues related to the economics of sports teams, spin-off benefits for communities, things like that. Victor has his Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota. He specializes in sports economics, lotteries, gambling, and forensic economics. He's also a past president of the National Association of Sports Economists. So we have two great experts here on campus, and what will happen to sports in this current environment's a burning question that many of us want to know about. So I think I'll just pass the baton to Victor and Rob.
All right, well, so thank you, Mike. And Rob and I are delighted to be here with all of you. You know, you're kind of accidentally going to get a little taste of what our students had here as we scrambled to move to an online world. Zoom has become our friend, and you kind of get to see what a bunch of the students got to do, although maybe a little less interactive here. One thing that Mike was going to tell you is at any point in the discussion, if you have any questions, we probably won't be able to answer a ton of them live, but we've got plenty of time at the end of the lecture here to answer a bunch of questions. I know a bunch of you submitted questions ahead of time, and there's also a Q&A button on your screen. And if you want to type something in as we go along, we'll see how many of those we get to as well. We're definitely going to focus on kind of COVID-19 and what's happening now. But you know, we can go a little far afield depending on what we have time for and what sort of questions you all have. So with all that, let's just dive right in here. So if we take a look at COVID-19, there are few industries that have been hit any worse than spectator sports. So for example, here, what we have here is just data on payroll employment. These are the number of people who are on business payrolls. This is measured every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what we see is we've seen a horrific damage to the economy as a whole from COVID-19. So we see the economy as a whole has lost about 21 million jobs in just 2 months here. To put that in perspective, during the Great Recession, which was called the Great Recession because it was such a severe economic downturn, but in the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, we lost about 10 million jobs over that time period. So in 2 months here, we've lost twice as many jobs overall in the economy as we had in the entire Great Recession. That's about a 14% drop in payroll jobs. 1 out of every 7 people that was on a business payroll in February was not on it by April. Of course, that's terrible, but this has not been evenly spread. If we look at leisure and hospitality overall, this is everyone. This is restaurants, this is hotels, this is arts and entertainment. We see about a 50% drop in employment. And in performing arts and spectator sports, so that includes both the Celtics as well as Hamilton on Broadway, we see again about a 50% drop in employment in this sector. So again, absolutely hammered by COVID-19. If we look at other measures, things like Nielsen ratings, you know, how many people are turning in on TV, ESPN down 62% in viewing. Without new shows to put on, without live sports, ESPN is pretty much dead in the water. The Golf Channel down 39%. Of course, some people have been benefiting from this. CNN up 170%, Fox News up 45%. The Learning Channel, you know, that's a lot of home improvement stuff. That's way up as well. I wonder if people are spending their 2 months figuring out how they're going to remodel their house. Obviously, streaming services way up as well. Netflix has gained 15.7 million viewers just in the first quarter. That doesn't even count people who have signed up here in April and May. Disney Plus, 50 million subscribers in just the 6 months they've been open. Tons of those coming on here at the last moment. Total live spectators at U.S. sporting events. About 30 million people last April went to a Major League Baseball game, or went out and watched the Boston Marathon, or went to an NBA or NHL game, or went to some sort of college sports. About 30 million people overall. Nowadays, about 0. So obviously, huge impact on this entire industry. Of course, one of the reasons is we know that live sporting events are about the worst possible situation for the spread of COVID-19. You have lots of people all in one place, all packed in together. So for example, Valencia, Spain, and Milan, Bergamo, Italy were the two first big epicenters of COVID-19 in Europe. If we were to go back in time and look at and look to see how COVID-19 was spreading in Europe in late March, the places that were getting hammered, northern Italy and the east coast of Spain, focused centered in Valencia and Milan. Why is that the case? We can actually track a ton of that to Atalanta and Valencia playing in a Champions League match in Italy. Thousands of fans. There's all the folks there, packing in a bunch of people singing, people chanting, people at least in at Atalanta hugging each other a lot because they won this game big, and a huge number of people on Valencia. They're the guys there in white and orange. About a third of that team actually came down with COVID-19. The thing is, this game took place before we even knew before we even knew the disease was spreading in Europe. So these are kind of super spreader events, very, very difficult to have live crowds at big sporting events, is basically the perfect storm for the spread of COVID-19. So what makes sports so problematic during COVID-19? Why is sports such a hard thing to do? Well, first of all, this is a product that can't be done at home. I mean, look, Rob and I, we're sitting here in our bedrooms. We can do things like have alumni lectures from the comfort of our own home. We can be separated in this way. That can't be done with sports because obviously we all have to get together here. Sports involve physical contact. It eliminates the ability to social distance. There is Lauren Mattis, Holy Cross class of 2020, doing some serious non-social distancing as she goes over the crowd there. Just as an aside, I don't know how many of you know this, but Lauren was drafted in the third round of the WNBA draft this year. So, again, for the vast majority of sports, simply impossible to have any sort of social distancing if you're actually going to play the game. Even if you do games without live audiences, there's still huge numbers of people that are involved in this. The Bundesliga, which is the big German soccer league, it has come back, but they still have 300 people at all the games, even without having any crowds there at all. When you count all the players, all the medical staff, all the training and coaching staff, when you talk about security, when you talk about broadcasting staff, when you talk about media, by the time you get all done there, you're looking at a huge number of people being involved. It's very difficult to do this without having a bunch of folks. And of course, one final big thing is that sports relies on what's known as the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis. So in sports economics, this is one of the classes I teach. In sports economics, the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis is the oldest of all theories of sports economics. It actually dates back to 1956. And the idea here is that sports derives most of its demand from people not knowing what's going on. A huge part of the entertainment aspect of sports is not just watching the athletes, but not knowing what's going to happen. So, for example, Netflix last year, the #1 show on Netflix, the #1 downloaded show on Netflix in 2019 was Friends. That's a show that's 25 years old. They haven't produced new episodes in over 2 decades. We all know that Ross and Rachel are going to end up with each other by the end of the show. And I hope I didn't ruin it for anyone. I apologize if I did. But the fact is, Friends is still entertaining to watch again, even if you've already seen it before. Sports, on the other hand, when you know the outcome, is distinctly uninteresting. Think about the Olympics. There's a great amount of excitement going on when you watch whether Michael Phelps is going to touch the wall half a second before his competitor or not. But fundamentally, swimming's not interesting to watch. It's the excitement of not knowing what's going to happen. The Super Bowl, far and away the most viewed sports product of any sort in the United States in a year. Over 100 million people watch the Super Bowl every year in the US alone. Almost no one ever watches a rerun of the Super Bowl. That means leagues don't have basically a catalog to fall back on because no one wants to watch old games. Disney can put The Lion King on Disney Plus and have people tune in. The NFL can't put Super Bowl number 19 on ESPN and have many people come in. So it makes it so that you really need some sort of live product, but it's extremely difficult to produce the live. One of the things when Rob and I ever give these lectures, we always talk about how surprisingly small that the sports industry is. So here on the left, we have sports league revenues, the amount of total revenue generated by all of the teams and the league itself and all the big American leagues there. So the NFL is about a $16 billion league. MLB, Major League Baseball, is next largest, followed by the NBA. Kind of depending on how you measure college football, it's in there. And then we get down NASCAR, we've got pro golfers in there. So we're talking about $50 or $60 billion a year in spectator sports being played in the United States. That's a lot of money, but actually, when you look at it, it's not so big. The NFL is about the same size as Sherwin-Williams, the paint store, okay? But we don't seem to think about Sherwin-Williams as being a gigantic mover and shaker in the U.S. industry. The NBA, Major League Baseball is about the same size as 1OK. Most of you probably don't even know what the 1OK is. 1OK is a big natural gas pipeline company in Oklahoma. The NBA, roughly the same size as Darden Restaurants. Darden Restaurants is Olive Garden, plus Lone Star. So the NBA is about the same size as Olive Garden. What do we got? College football, Post brands there. That's literally Grape Nuts and Raisin Bran. So, you know, all of college football, roughly the same size as Post cereal. That top one there, Energizer, that literally is the bunny, right? And the batteries. So Energizer bunny, Picky Bo's Coffee Company. So again, it's surprisingly small in terms of actual economics. That being said, the sociological impact of sports is way bigger than just the dollar amount. So I'm just going to pose this question to all of you and let you take 5 seconds to think about it yourself. For all of you out there individually, think about it yourself. When did COVID-19 become a real thing for you? When was the holy cow moment for you? I can tell you for myself, I know exactly when it is. It was March 11th, the evening of March 11th. That's when Holy Cross said we were canceling classes for the rest of the year. And March 12th is a date that many, many Americans will say that that's the moment that it became real. Why? That was the moment that the NBA said we are stopping all of our games indefinitely. When Utah Jazz player Rudy Gobert tested positive for COVID-19, literally right before the game. That's the referees checking in with the NBA head office about whether they were actually going to play the game with the teams there and a bunch of the crowd there. That was a wow, this just got real moment for a huge number of people. Because again, people's impressions of sports is much bigger than just the dollar amount. So a question that we might want to ask ourselves, we know that it's going to be extremely difficult to play any type of spectator sports with fans, again, because we know the things that happened in Milan with the Champions League game. We know how troubling it is to put 20,000 people in close contact with one another inside an arena for 2 hours while they're screaming and singing and chanting. But can sports be played without fans? Turns out we know that it can. Prior to the season, since World War II, about 150 soccer matches in Europe have been played behind closed doors. Often for a variety of reasons, often due to instances of fan racism, and essentially as punishment for that, fan violence, as a way, again, to both punish fan bases as well as to protect the players themselves, or instances of corruption. So we've had this happen before, and so we can actually look to Europe for these models. We are seeing, because of that, we are seeing lots of sports now returning finally to closed-door matches. So the Bundesliga in Germany, that's the big soccer league in Germany, returned to action on May 10th. It's the first major European sports league to come back. Serie A, which is the Italian league, and La Liga, which is the Spanish league with Real Madrid and Barcelona, and the EPL, the English Premier League, they return the week of June 11th. So soccer fans are covered pretty well here. There's a picture of one of the first games. That's Eintracht Frankfurt coming back for its first game in completely empty stadiums. Again, about 300 people here for that. In the U.S., we've seen a variety of these things as well. So we've seen some modified golf events, basically match play against individual players against one another rather than full tournaments. NASCAR has returned for some events, particularly ones that are close by in North Carolina, where most of the teams are based, so they don't have to travel much. Mixed martial arts has had some events as well. We've already seen some announcements. The Belmont Stakes, the horse race, that's going to come back in June, again behind closed doors. Literally in the last day or two, yesterday, Major League Soccer announced that they will start some games in late June, while the NBA literally today announced that they're coming back in late July. The NHL has also announced that they will come back, but no timetable for that, maybe mid-August. But not everyone is coming back. Other places have essentially canceled. It is widely believed that minor league baseball in the United States will skip this summer entirely. Marathons, for example, the Boston Marathon was originally postponed and has now been eliminated completely. Wimbledon is gone. And not every soccer league in Europe is following Germany. So the Eredivisie, that's the big Dutch league, and Liga 1, which is league, they have decided not to come back. Notice there's a couple here I don't have. I don't have any information about the NCAA here, nor do I have any information about the NFL. At this point, neither of those two big leagues have decided what they're going to do, nor has Major League Baseball. The NFL at this point says that they're going to go on like planned, but it's not at all clear what that really means in a world where you can't put 70,000 people in a stadium. So how do closed doors change the game? First of all, we actually have some data on the way they changed the game literally, based, first of all, on the handful of games that we've seen so far this year, as well as those other past games. It does eliminate home field advantage completely. So if you ever go to games and your cheering, in fact, does influence the game. Don't think it, but it doesn't work at home. So if you're cheering at home and yelling at the TV, that we have no evidence that helps. But we actually do have evidence that it helps, because we know that home field advantage exists for most sports. When you play them behind closed doors, those get eliminated completely. I'd also like to point out it reduces referee errors and potential referee bias. I myself used to be a referee for Major League Soccer, and I still work for the NCAA for Division I soccer. Apparently, I'm not perfect, and that I'm influenced by the crowds. So how do closed doors games change the game from a revenue side? Well, we can take a look at some of these where we have some pretty good data. The US Open tennis tournament, one of the big four majors in tennis, actually has broken down its $350 million that it earns every year. About a third of it comes from their broadcasting. Another 70 million comes from sponsorships, which you will get in part because you're broadcast and in part because people are in the stadium seeing your brand. Concessions and other things that get sold at the venue is another 30 million, and the tickets themselves are about 130 million. So the US Open, if they can manage to have this game, even if it's behind closed doors, they can still salvage maybe a little more than 50% of the money there. There's what Federer and Serena. The NFL. Harder to get data that's broken down easily with that, but again, with the NFL, broadcasting, their national broadcasting revenue is in the 40% range, with other national revenue, which includes things like merchandise and sponsorships and licensing, brings that up to about 55-60%. With local revenue, the stuff you get in the stadium, although again, there's a handful of sponsorships in there that may still go on, even if there's no fans in the stadium. That gives you about 50 to 60% of the money that the NFL can capture, even if there's no one in the stadium. Now, mind you, no one wants to lose 40% of their money, but 60% is better than zero. The NBA also says that they think they can salvage about 60% of their revenue by going to a model where they're just showing games on TV and not in person. Major League Soccer, on the other hand, you look at their broadcasting revenue is far less as a percentage of what they bring in. Major League Soccer is a wildly successful league in terms of getting people to the stadium, but not wildly successful in getting people to watch on TV. Therefore, Major League Soccer is someone that is much less likely to benefit from games behind closed doors than the NFL. They're looking at maybe only being able to capture 40% of their money or so if they go to a closed door situation. So we have lots of evidence that, closed doors is going to significantly harm the leagues themselves. They get a huge chunk of their money this way. However, depending on the league, and basically the bigger the league, the better off you are. The bigger you are, the more chance you have to salvage some of that money by at least going broadcasting only and going behind closed doors. Mind you, if you go to something like minor league baseball, they require they get all of their money essentially from people showing up at the stadium. Very, very few people watch minor league baseball on TV. And so again, depending on what sort of place you are, you're much more dependent on either in-person or being able to survive with the non-in-person. So what about local economies? And I'm going to hand this over to Rob now, and we're going to talk a little bit about local economies, talk about, what happens to the businesses in the area. We'll talk a little bit about Worcester because Worcester's in the midst of a big building project itself, and I'm going to have Rob take it away.
Thanks, Victor. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Baumann. Let me make sure you can hear me. Yeah, there it is. My name's Rob Baumann. I'm chair of the Economics and Accounting Department, Victor's colleague and co-author. Victor, I tell you what, look at the Q&A. I've been answering some of these questions that have come in, but I've left a couple of them for you because I just think you're in a better position to answer them. So take a look at those if you don't mind. And also, if you don't mind, Victor's controlling the slides here. If you don't, just go ahead and show this whole thing because I want to make sure the map is on there. I at least want the map, you know what I mean? So do whatever you got to do over there to...
Let me give you that one first, and then we'll go to the second map later.
Okay. All right. Honestly, where Victor and I started working together was this idea of how much does a sporting event bring to its local area. I hadn't worked in sports at all. I was really more of a statistician and kind of a data-oriented person. And boy, it was after doing a couple of these projects that I realized what an important question this is, because what you see are municipalities funding money into sports. And sometimes they will argue that that money that they are funding is for economic growth. And of course, like Mike said in his introduction, it's a complicated statistical project, but it's a pretty natural experiment to look back at some of these claims of events that have already happened and take a look to see if they've actually kind of produced that economic impact. So what you are looking at on that map, Victor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're on the north side of Chicago here. We're looking at Wrigley Field.
Yeah, that's Wrigley Field. And I don't know if you can see a cursor on here or not, but I used to live right there. So right there in Wrigleyville. The house is still standing, so I must not have done too badly.
Oh, yeah, they rebuilt it after you left, huh? How about that? You could see these Google Maps icons of where all the bars and kind of restaurants are about there. And you can see it's pretty easy, especially if you've been down to Wrigley. This is one of those baseball stadiums that if you are a fan, this is kind of a can't miss because the whole package is really neat, from the environment that's outside of the stadium to what's going on the inside of the stadium and the experience of Wrigley itself. But the logic is this, if you were a bartender or working in one of these restaurants near the area, you can expect to be more busy when the games are in town. And anybody that has been to a sporting event, I'm guessing many people that are on this Zoom call right now have experienced that kind of thing firsthand. I remember one of the first projects Victor and I did was about the Super Bowl. And like most of our projects, we were pessimistic about the kind of money that the NFL claimed it would bring a particular area. And somebody found a representative for the NFL, I think this was the Super Bowl that was being held in Miami, who said something to the effect, I guarantee those guys have never been down here to see what this is like. And our attitude was like, well, if you have the data, you don't have to be there, all right? Because our argument is largely like what you're seeing in the local economic area like this right around Wrigley is somewhat offset by what happens in the rest of the city. So some of these caveats that we have here, excuse me, local neighborhood effects, substitution effects, and this last thing about public finance, I'll get to a second. This bullet point that you see at the top, normally economists would say the loss of sports to an economy is minor. That's because what's happening is that when a sport disappears, people find other ways to spend money, all right? And so it's basically just a redistribution. So when a local municipal area funds a stadium, let's say, which we see happen all the time. You can see that last bullet point. There's $17 billion in municipal funds for stadium construction. All right. Now, these are not, and again, understand these are not giant industries. The biggest industry, the NFL, is kind of similar to Sherwin-Williams, the paint company. All right. A lot of these municipal bonds and these commitments by the public are made with the argument that these stadiums will be economic drivers. And for the past 10 or 15 years, Victor and I have been singing that song just with different places. That's just simply never the case. All right. When the team disappears for whatever reason, people tend to find other ways to spend their money. Could you click, Victor, on and give me that map of the Worcester Stadium and the situation there? There it is. So here's a picture of the proposed Woosok Stadium, whose construction has recently restarted after, of course, it was delayed for COVID-19 about a couple of months ago. The Pawtucket Red Sox, if you haven't heard, are relocating to Worcester. This is the AAA team of the Boston Red Sox. And to lure the AAA team here, the city is basically building the team its own stadium. So, in the very near future, perhaps, as likely as next spring, the city will own a baseball stadium. All right. How did the city fund this? Well, the mayor charged our city manager to find a financing plan that would not directly raise taxes. All right. Now, if you're thinking that seems impossible, the city is taking another commitment, I would agree with you. All right. But here's sort of the financial, I don't want to call it magic, but the financial plan that makes that goal possible. That area that you see in red here that they're calling the ballpark district, that sets up what's called a tax increment financing district. So in situations like this where you want to develop an area, what you see in red currently, there's not much there. All right. By the way, this is the area that's like kind of up north of Kelly Square and kind of heading into downtown. Always, if you're familiar with Worcester, this has been an area that's been difficult for the city to develop. If you talk to some people on city council for 30, 40 years, this has been a decades-long problem. So right now, there's not much there. There's a couple of, there's light industry kind of here and there, but a lot of abandoned parking lots, no development whatsoever. So when the stadium comes, what the city did is they got a deal with a developer who plans on building a whole lot of things in the red that you see on your screen, namely hotels, restaurants, bars, and the like. This is Dennis Dowdle, if you've been following this in the news, who's the main developer. So at the same time that Worcester is engaging with the kind of stadium it's going to build for the Pawtucket Red Sox, it's talking to this developer because it knows that its financing scheme, which it has to have in place in order to not directly fund revenues from the city budget, has to come from this tax increment. All right, tax increment financing, TIF. What we're doing here is that we're raising the property values in the red by putting things there that aren't currently there. Those extra revenues that go to the city in the terms, in the form of property taxes, are used to fund the stadium. And so the idea is that the stadium is like a magnet for this economic growth. And we're going to carve out this neighborhood that surrounds the stadium. And all of the extra money we get from that red is going to fund what you see is in the blue. All right. And that's how a city could pitch something as buying a $100 million stadium. It's actually more expensive than that now, but that's what it was about a year ago. And even though the city of Worcester has a budget of approximately $660, $700 million, so we're talking like 1/6 to 1/7 of the entire city budget, they're borrowing that money. It's not directly impacting it, assuming, of course, the development comes. As you can imagine, Victor and I were appalled, all right? But we really couldn't do anything to stop it. This is a long story that, if you want to hear more about it, we could share it during the Q&A. But it was a really masterful job on the part of the team and the city to get this to the end zone. Some things happened sort of along the way, though. Like one issue was that they realized there was extra construction costs because the land wasn't properly level. That added about 10 or $20 million, which means that red district expanded to a larger spot, all right, than what you're looking at before. And then, of course, COVID-19 happened during that period, and construction was stalled. This is problematic because the team needs to move in there next year. Their lease is up at McCoy Stadium at Pawtucket at the end of this season. And so it's got to have a place to go. And so there's a lot of pressure to get this thing done. All right. So this is sort of the situation in Worcester. For the next 30 years, we're going to be paying off this loan for the stadium. And we're going to be doing that in hopes that this neighborhood is going to rebound because of the team and it's attracting extra people there. So I could go on this for a long time, but I'll keep this short. Like, I think another thing that has always stuck in my craw about these particular deals is that all the revenue goes to the team. So if you have heard that Polar Park is the name of this new Woosok Stadium, you're correct. But that licensing deal, all of that money goes to the team. So imagine this, the city owns the stadium, all right? It's renting out the name of that stadium, and yet the proceeds from that rent are going to the person that is renting it, all right? Highly unusual. And I would argue, like, this is kind of what's fascinating and really what kind of got me interested in sports economics. Look, the NFL is the size of Sherman-Williams, but like, we don't think about Sherman-Williams in the same way we think about the NFL. Like, it's far more outsized in our mind. And you can kind of see evidence of people not making economic decisions when it comes to stadium finance, whether to host the Olympics, so on and so forth. All right, take me to the next slide, Victor, before I go on and on about the Blue Sox.
So just one thing, obviously, to add here related to COVID-19, all of this planned development is now on hold. So this entire new area of development in the red is what's supposed to pay for the area in the blue. None of the area in the red is currently being developed because who in their right mind would build a new hotel in a world where no one is going to hotels anymore? Who would build new restaurants in a world where no one's going to restaurants anymore? No one's building new housing, no one's building new retail when no one can go to retail. And of course, what that means is all of the money required to pay for the building, which they are still building, is not materializing. And unfortunately, those bonds need to be paid, whether the actual red area materializes or not. Now I know a bunch of you have this question, right? When you talk to when you register for colleges and universities. So I'm going to let Rob talk to that since he is a graduate of not just Ohio State, but the Ohio State University.
That's right. That's in the charter, by the way. That's one of my favorite pieces of free advertising, even though I know it's grating to a lot of people out there. So here's some information about the budgets at athletics at Ohio State. Let's see, we had a lot of questions. We saw your questions prior to the chat, and there was a lot of public financing, or not public financing, but financing questions, like about to professional sports and, of course, to colleges. So we thought we would show you like a big athletic department, and then we would give you estimates best we can on our athletic department. So Ohio State for sports, and Holy Cross offers a lot of sports, but I promise you OSU offers more. All right. You name it, they've got it. They have the best synchronized swimming program in the nation. Of course, there's like 4 schools that compete in that, but nevertheless, like, it's something that they would promote if you were on campus there. So that's about $204 million that they're spending on that. And we've got a nice pie chart here to give you a sense of where their revenues are coming from. It was just yesterday that the president at OSU announced that they intend to hold football games. If you are from Ohio, that is not surprising. If you've been to Ohio, you've probably noticed like the whole Ohio State Buckeye thing is a little much. You know what I mean? I would consider its fandom like way stronger than anything that you have out here. So it would be really difficult to imagine that they were canceling this season. But the president said that any home football games that they have would have to be properly social distanced. And they're not making any commitments on what that means right now because, of course, we don't know exactly exactly what the situation will be come September. So let's imagine, they've got like maybe a quarter of the people in the stadium, maybe a tenth. It's really hard to imagine like kind of what's proper here. At OSU, like you're talking like big long benches with numbers on them. So people are packed in like pretty tight. So that $70 million that they're getting for tickets, a standard OSU football game, is going to cost you like about $125 or something like that to go to. I don't know, like maybe we're looking at a quarter of that, so instead of 70 million, 15, 17 million, something in that ballpark. Then we have, it's kind of hard to say like what the bowl revenue is going to be at this point, because the bowls might have a hard time attracting attendance. And so that might go down. And so we're looking at a place like OSU. And I guess like if there's some good news about this situation, at least as it pertains to Holy Cross, I think places like Ohio State are going to have a harder time kind of managing this, because more of their athletic department's revenue are based on people walking in the door at the stadium. Ohio State will pay like those sort of preseason games, like where they're paying a smaller school to kind of come in the stadium. Those schools will get $2 million to show up. And that's because there's 100,000 seats in that stadium. It's about $100 a ticket. So on tickets alone, you're talking about $10 million. We haven't even put it on television yet, right? And so paying a school $2 million is kind of a deal, quite frankly. And the money that a place like Ohio State makes from football obviously helps it fund its smaller sports programs. Go ahead, Victor, take us to the next one.
Just as a quick aside, a bunch of this other money in here includes things like concessions and parking, which of course also dissipate when you don't have as many people there. It also includes sports camps. Their entire summer sports camp program, obviously, basically, nationwide at all colleges has disappeared. So we have some estimates of Holy Cross. We're not going to say these are exactly right, but we kind of piece these together from both Holy Cross official numbers that they report, as well as other pieces that come together from similar schools. But go ahead, Rob. Yep.
Oh, no, it's pretty straightforward here. This is like I said, not all of these are exact numbers, but we have a pretty good feeling. And, when I first saw this table, like what immediately stuck out to me, take a look at the school funds, all right, on the revenue side at a place like OSU. And of course, like best we can guess, like at Holy Cross, all right. I guess what we're saying here is that Holy Cross is a little bit more accustomed, all right, to funding from its budget the sports that it plays, all right? And one way to justify that is I think like maybe 25% of our students are playing one of these varsity sports. So, Holy Cross kind of sees, I think like we've got maybe some trustees on here that can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression has always been like, this is really something that we fund, like just like we fund any sort of other initiative here. And we're not necessarily expecting revenue from tickets or necessarily TV to cover this particular thing. And of course, that reality at a place like OSU is far different. Anything you want to add there, Victor?
Yeah, again, just look at these numbers, right? If college football, or at least in-person college football, disappears from Holy Cross this year, that total amount of ticket revenue for us barely goes down. Holy Cross is hurting in some ways on the sports side. For example, the NCAA makes significant grants to every Division I school in the country based on how much it earns during March Madness. March Madness didn't occur, which means there's about $1 billion hole in the NCAA's budget, which means that's about $1 billion less to distribute to places like Holy Cross. And in terms of money straight from the NCAA, Holy Cross actually makes about as much as Ohio State does. In fact, things like March Madness are a huge redistribution mechanism from the rich to the poor. And some of those monies are going down. But yeah, you would much rather be an athlete actually at Holy Cross than Ohio State this year. Again, because, Holy Cross was not planning on bringing in $70 million of funds from people watching college football. And of course, the biggest show of them all, right? And this is what we're actually going to end with here. And we got lots of questions we'll have a chance to get to, hopefully. But it is the Olympics. So obviously, we know the Olympics have already been postponed by a year. The Tokyo Olympics were wildly expensive even before postponement. The total amount that it was planning on costing, the official number, at least one official number that has been put out, is about $12.6 billion. although other estimates put that number way above that, maybe even double or more of that. Postponing the games, extremely expensive. Oh, I actually just want to say one more thing. You can see down in the lower corner, that's the new stadium they're building for the Olympics. That's actually been pared down. So that's only $1.5 billion stadium right now. Before, it was actually a $2 billion stadium before they did some cost-cutting measures. At $2 billion, just the stadium in Tokyo cost more than the entire 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, even after accounting for inflation. So again, this is a wildly expensive event, and postponement has just put a huge additional price tag on that. At least one number that we've seen being thrown around is an extra $2.7 billion, the cost associated with postponing in a year. That's because you've got to maintain and rent facilities for an entire additional year. You have cost financing, right? Basically, the Olympics puts everything on a credit card, right? And they're planning on getting a big payment so they can pay off that credit card. Of course, now you've got to finance that credit card for another year. Lots of contractual obligations and conversion delays. So for example, the Olympic Village, where all the athletes are going to be staying in order to recapture some of that money, all of those Olympic Village apartments have been resold as condos. And everyone was planning on moving in October. Now you have to buy out all those contracts from everyone and delay everyone's move-in date by by a year. And of course, that's wildly expensive. And of course, even with all these additional costs, there is no guarantee that the Olympics even take place in 2021. We'll end with this question. Will Japan risk having 11,109 athletes from 206 countries converging on their country? It's hard to imagine a worse situation to spread disease around the world than having people from all over the world come and all participate in very close quarters for 3 weeks and then disperse back to their home countries. I think many people, now mind you, Rob and I are not those sort of doctors, but there is some real question about whether it's going to be possible to even do this, even with a year delay. So with that, thank you for coming, for listening to us. We're going to have some chance to answer some of your questions here and see what we got. I think Mike is going to moderate some of these and see how they're coming.
Yeah, I'm going to try to sort through some of them. Thanks very much for that. Rob did answer a few earlier directly, but there's one question I'll summarize as the downstream. What's the downstream effect of the Olympic sports not having sponsorships? This person cites the fact that organizations rely on funding from the Olympic Committee and the Paralympic Committee for national championships and other kind of downstream sports. And in addition to the problems with the Olympics, they're asking about, you know, the downstream problems for amateur organizations beneath them.
Yeah, so this is a great question. This actually goes to lots of issues. You know, who is getting hurt worst by this? And it's not LeBron James, right? LeBron James is going to take a huge hit to his income this year because of the NBA. But mind you, for LeBron James, that means going from $70 million in total earnings this year, including salary and endorsements, to maybe $30 million, right? It does absolutely mean that guys like Bob Kraft take a big hit, but again, you're talking about multi-billionaire Bob Kraft. Who really gets hurt for these? It's the folks that are the ticket takers, the ushers, the folks working concessions at games. Those are people who are losing jobs and they are not able to make other jobs, right? If you're working concessions and you lose your job normally, not a problem. I just go down the road to the next restaurant, the next bar, and I get a job there. Of course, that's not happening in this economy. And again, if you're a concession worker, if you're an usher, you're making minimum wage, which means that you're unlikely to have any sort of significant pool of savings to get you through this time. We want to talk about the athletes that are hurt in this. We're talking about minor league baseball. Canceled completely because, again, very little opportunity for those athletes to earn money via media, via sponsorship. So no chance there. And again, minor league baseball players, especially at the single A, double A area, they're not even making minimum wage for the amount of time they put in. And of course, this also applies to all the Olympic sports. If you are a champion in Taekwondo, you aren't making big money. Your one chance to capitalize is go to the biggest show on earth, right? To the greatest show on earth. Go to the Olympics, get a chance to get those sponsorships, get a chance to become, kind of this premier level coach who can go out and give seminars. Without the Olympics happening, your one real chance to cash in on the sport, if you aren't, if you're not Alex Morgan in women's soccer, if you're not Michael Phelps in swimming, if you're not LeBron James in basketball, your chance to really get on people's radars and cash in on your ability is your one chance in the spotlight. If that spotlight doesn't occur, you're in trouble. And again, when the International Olympic Committee makes billions of dollars with those broadcast revenues that are associated with the Olympics, that money filters back into national organizations and the individual Olympics folks. This is going to be a really tough next 4 years if you're an up-and-coming athlete in Taekwondo or in rowing or again, any of these non-monetary sports. It's going to be really tough.
And that's dire. We did have someone suggest that the home field advantage isn't entirely eliminated. They make the point that it's not just referee bias, the lack of travel, familiar surroundings, sightlines for shooting basketballs, normal routines, home cooking, and of course, the bottom of the ninth are all advantages that still there. But
so as it turns out, I saw that question when it came in, and that was a great question. As it turns out, again, we've only had a chance to look at soccer games because those are the only ones that we've really seen played in any sort of big numbers behind closed doors. But actually what the data is showing us is, in fact,
doesn't matter, huh?
It all disappears. So the actual home field advantage completely disappears once you take fans out of the game. So we can speculate that it's referee bias or other things. But as it turns out, in fact, the data suggests that it really does disappear, even though you wouldn't think it would, but that's what the data says. So that was
even the last ups in the bottom of the ninth, huh?
So again, we don't have any data on baseball because we've never seen baseball played behind closed doors. But from soccer, what we do see for sure is that it disappears completely in the roughly 150 matches that we have seen played behind closed doors in the last half.
Somebody was curious about the source of data for, I think it's the economic data, judging from the time the question was asked. All that economic, financial data, I guess I should say. How do you compile that?
Can I? This is mine. Don't you dare answer this for me. Pipe down over there. Well, look, it all depends on the source and what you're trying to do. In fact, like a lot of times, Victor and I have had projects that have been a function of like, oh my God. I remember one day we realized that we had daily arrival data into the state of Hawaii by plane. And of course, like, the vast majority of people that go to Hawaii are arriving by plane. And we had that like by America and international sources. And so we started looking for things in Hawaii, that we could measure, and we found the Pro Bowl. Going back before that, there is this great county level data monthly too in Florida on what's called taxable sales, which is all the sales that were made in that particular county in that particular month. That could be taxed according to the sales tax. And that was a boon for us because Florida, of course, is a regular host of things like an All-Star game or a Super Bowl and the like. So it really is kind of project specific, but the best kind of projects, this reminds me of another question I saw on there, like a hard thing about this is that these effects sometimes are needle in a haystack. So really the best kind of projects try to shrink down either the time frame or the area. I had somebody that I answered this question speak about, there's a PGA event that happens in Norton, Mass. that I believe has been canceled. I don't know that for sure. I apologize. And that person, I think, was just trying to make the point, like, look, this is a big deal for Norton, Mass. And like, because we have slides in there that say, like, you know, this is a relatively small drop in the bucket. I totally agree with that person. This is bad for Norton. There's no question about it. Like, a lot of these results that you see here, even in the case of Worcester, which is not a giant place, are cities investing in one neighborhood and finding themselves kind of overall in the same position with or without the stadium, because while people did go to the game, they just kind of went a little bit less to everything else in the area. So sometimes, like the analogy, it's the concentrated gain versus the diffuse loss, you know, might be a way that you could think about it. Thank you. Go ahead.
I would follow up on that, again, so Rob and I have been preaching this idea of substitution effect, right? One of the reasons we don't see a big fall in economic activity, for example, you know, over the last 2 decades, we've had strikes in all the major sports that have eliminated seasons. About a dozen seasons of professional sports across all the sports have been lost over the last couple of decades, and we don't see any impact at all on local economies when these seasons disappear. You lose an entire year of the NHL, it doesn't even show up in the economy. And again, what our answer there is, it's the substitution effect. People stop going to hockey, but they start going to more other things. That being said, in a COVID-19 world, that actual thing actually falls apart. And Rob and I have been much more frequently saying here in the last 2 months that losing the NBA is actually a really big deal now. And the reason it's a big deal now is that, you know, if you're not going to an NBA game, it's not like you're spending your money elsewhere in the local economy. You know, some of these losses are real losses that you're not making up anywhere else. And that's an important issue here. That's completely different than most of the other times we've seen sports disappear for some reason.
Everyone's following, of course, the saga with the MLB and the Players Association. I had heard recently that it's a brilliant negotiating ploy by the league because they are dividing and conquering the Mike Trouts from the first-year players in terms of their strategy for negotiating concessions. I mean, is it as random as it seems, or do you think that both sides, the Players Association and the league itself, have a strategy that hangs together for these negotiations?
So let me say that I have a very, very strong bias in favor of the players in all of these cases. The players are always in a weaker bargaining position than the owners, because players' careers are only a couple of years, which means that, you know, they can't hold out for any amount of time in order to make things better for them in the future, and no one can afford to do that. But Bob Kraft, for example, he can be an owner of the Patriots for 20, 30, 40 years. And so there's always this tension there. Major League Baseball is unique among American sports in that the players aren't guaranteed a percentage of the revenue. In all of the other sports, roughly 50% of all the money that comes in, the players have negotiated that they get it back out on the other side, which means basically everyone is in it together. In all of the other sports, everyone is in it together, because as revenues fall, because of the way the contracts are written, what's going to the players is going to fall by a roughly proportional amount as the amount that falls for the owners. What seems like is happening here is the owners want to reduce players' salaries to a fixed percentage of revenues when times are bad, without then that persisting later when times get good again. So at least that's my feeling of that. Again, I'm very biased on the part of the players here. I really feel for the folks who really bring the talent to the league but don't often get a chance to fully capitalize on that, simply because their careers are too short. I'll just share one stat for sure. The average number of games that a major league player in baseball appears in, these are field players, not pitchers. So if you count all the players in Major League Baseball who have appeared in at least one major league game, the average number of major league games that a player appears in over their career is 140 games, which means the average Major League Baseball player plays less than one full season of games You know, that's a really hard career, a very short career, and it gives, again, owners who can who can wait out things for months or years, gives them a huge bargaining advantage, and I feel for the players usually.
We had a question from folks about the difference between large market teams like, say, the Yankees and small market teams like Milwaukee, whether the impact is the same, or would it be like college sports?
That's a great question. That's a super hard question to answer. Rob talked about data issues, and when we're looking at things like overall economies, we as economists have tons of data that we can look at, because data on overall economies there's all sorts of data. You just need to go out and get it. When you're talking about individual businesses, like individual teams, the actual data is super hard to get, because most of these teams are privately owned, which means that they're not required to release any public data of any sort. The data we had, for example, the reason we had better data actually on Ohio State than our own institution is because, again, Ohio State as a public entity has to release data in a way that a private agency doesn't. So I actually can't answer the question between, you know, who gets off better in COVID-19, Milwaukee, or you know, their brother, you know, 70 miles south at the Chicago Cubs, because we don't have very good access to data there. Probably the bigger market you are, the better off you are in general, because the Yankees fill up their seats pretty quick, but have an unlimited ability to broadcast. So if you're already capacity constrained in your stadium in a way that Milwaukee isn't. So probably the Yankees have much more ability to sell their product to a big media market than just selling in person. So I think I'd rather be the Yankees now than the Brewers, other than, of course, the obvious caveat that they are the Yankees.
Yeah, that's right. There are a couple of questions asking about the effect of all of this, or your expectations of the effect of all this on sponsorships. Many large companies have paid to have the Fleet Center named after them. No longer, of course, TD North. I mean, will there be clawbacks, or is there a basis for clawbacks if the Staples Center is not used? Will Staples or Pepsi or folks like that be able to get rebates?
Well, I would say that one set of people who are not hurting during COVID-19 are contract lawyers. Certainly if I'm Pepsi, if I'm TD Bank North, if I am Gillette, I am certainly asking about exactly, you know, why do I have my name on a stadium that no one is going in and out of? Why do I have my name on a Major League Soccer jersey or on a French La Liga jersey if people aren't actually seeing that? And there'll be work for months or years to come in how that clawback occurs.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just wrote back to somebody who gave that anecdote about Pepsi, and oh shoot, it just escaped my mind. But we see there was a lot of similar questions, like kind of in this vein of sort of what could be clawed back. And oh no, it just came to me. I'm sorry. Issues about the CBA and things like what's going on right now impact player salaries, salary caps for leagues that have those down the road. I mean, I would say they kind of have to, but remember, in a lot of these major professional sports leagues, the CBA could run between 5 and 10 years. So the ones that are going to be most sensitive to this are CBAs that are going to be up in the near future. And Victor, maybe you know which, I don't have a sense of what that calendar is off the top of my head, but I would be worried if I were running a league with a CBA coming up pretty close, because revenues are going to be lower.
That's actually, again, one of the advantages of the way that everyone but Major League Baseball has done it is that the CBA basically builds in basically the whole fundamental CBA is one sentence: is the players get this amount and the owners get the rest. Everything else is just details, right? The big high level thing is what percentage do you get, and obviously all of those contracts go down, or at least the salary caps and everything go down Most of the leagues, certainly the NBA, I know for sure, but most of the other leagues also have pieces in that say that guaranteed contracts are no longer guaranteed if there are act of God types of things going on. So, so most of those guaranteed contracts are not quite as guaranteed as those players might have hoped. That being said, this is one that I don't have my thumb on the scale here for the players quite in the same way. Obviously, if revenues go way down, players need to take their piece of that.
We had a college question asking about the operating, are there significant operating economic differences between a D1 and a D3 NCAA sport? So, and Holy Cross is kind of in between there. So I don't know if it was focused on Holy Cross, but let's say a major sport and
this is a super hard question to answer. That being said, if we were to compare a school like Holy Cross to a roughly similar sized school, WPI, also right here in Worcester, what we find is that the total operating costs at WPI are about $5 million, while the total operating costs at Holy Cross are about $33 million. There's a giant caveat in there in that at Holy Cross, of that $33 million, maybe $13 million of that is athletic scholarships. There is huge amounts of real, honest debate about how much a scholarship should count as an expense or not, because at Holy Cross, we give generous scholarships to all sorts of students, not just athletes. And if we had admitted that same group of people in and gave them need-based scholarships, the total amount that would be there would be fairly similar to the same amount that we're giving in athletic scholarships. So there's some real question about whether you include that. But if we were to take away all of the financial aid given to athletes at Holy Cross, now you're talking about $20 million in operating costs at Holy Cross versus about $5 million at WPI. Part of that is we do offer some more sports, but other pieces are, that full-time coach at that men's soccer coach at WPI is not a full-time coach in the same way that Marco is here at Holy Cross. Our full-time basketball coach at WPI is making a fraction of what a Division I basketball coach earns at Holy Cross. And of course, WPI, they are traveling to Babson. They're traveling to Mount Holyoke. They're traveling to Wheaton College for their league games. We're traveling to Bucknell. We're traveling to Navy. We're traveling to Colgate. Obviously, huge travel costs associated with that as well. But again, WPI versus Holy Cross, we're looking at operating costs of roughly $20 million at Holy Cross versus $5 million at WPI.
There's a question about MLB owners. I'll read it because it's a question in the statement. Why do MLB owners believe they have a right to be profitable? The value of franchises affords them the ability to borrow whatever money is necessary to cover expenses to allow the sport to continue as we navigate through the crisis. Some teams will lose money, but none of them will lose money remotely proportional to the rate at which their franchises' valuations tend to increase. I'm not an economist, but that seems to assume that every team in Major League Baseball has an upwardly trending valuation and a shot at making a profit. Is that fair?
Rob, you're off. Why don't you hit your
Rob.
hit your microphone there?
You're still off.
Oh, so Rob is on a rant here. It's probably good that his microphone is off because it probably got at least PG-13 there for a moment. While Rob figures that out.
Here I am.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can go.
Okay, Victor can give you some details about some of these valuations. Some of my favorite, like, minor anecdotes, like every now and then I'll ask students, like, who's a Yankee fan in the audience? And, like, a percentage of Holy Cross kids will raise their hand, whatever, usually about a third. And I'll say, okay, like, you guys, the owners, the Steinbrenner family, who owned it before that and what did they pay for it? And the answer to that is that the CBS Corporation owned the New York Yankees. George Steinbrenner bought it from them for about $10 million. And if legend is correct, he had about less than $1 million of that in cash, kind of borrowed and sort of fudged the rest. This is Loren, Ohio, because he initially really wanted to buy the Cleveland Indians. And for whatever reason, he couldn't do that. And he bought the Yankees. And I think that worked out well for the Steinbrenner family. And so this is just an example of, I totally agree with you, the value of these franchises are going up and up. Why do they feel like they need to make a profit? These are the kind of questions I ask myself when I'm not feeling like an economist when I was dealing with the Woo Sox. So what made me, think about this, and what I tried to impress upon our city councilors is that understand, like, as you guys are negotiating, those are profit maximizers across the table. It's a business to the Lukinos, to the Steinbrenners, and the like. Meanwhile, the problem I feel like in the Worcester example, and you see this a lot of other places, is that they are it's a mixture of emotion and finance, all right? And of course, like when that kind of person is negotiating against somebody that is a pure profit maximizer, there's going to be a certain amount of, I think exploitation is the wrong word, that goes a bit too far, but I think you know what I'm trying to say here. So like, why do, there's almost like a shamelessness of like a Jerry Jones, let's say, or a Larry Lucchino, who will go to a city and ask for basically them to borrow 1/6 of their entire operating budget for a given year. The answer is because they can. Okay, this is how these models effectively operate. And thanks for listening to my rant, Victor. If you've got more calm details on that, you go ahead and take it away from there.
So the one thing I would say is that, Rob and I aren't anti-sports by any means. And to the extent that regular businesses want to make profit all the time, that's great. And, we would say any business out there, any sports team out there, you want to go start a team, you want to build a stadium, fantastic. If you want the public to pay for part of your business, that's where it becomes a totally different question. You better be bringing something very, very special to the table that you can't capture as a private business if you want to do that. So, for example, if you're going to bring a vaccine for COVID-19 to the table, I'm happy to subsidize some of that, right? But probably not for a stadium. We don't see much evidence that stadiums bring any sort of significant economic benefits to the communities that build them with taxpayer funds. And the one that I like talking about, at least here in Worcester, is a typical AAA ballpark attracts the same number of people every year that a 16-screen movie megaplex can. But no one would even consider giving, Cineplex Odeon or any of the big theater chains, or Regal, no one would consider giving them $75 million of taxpayer money to build a movie theater in Worcester. You would never even consider it. But that's considered, something, well, of course you do that for baseball. Again, I think with sports, we lose our minds a little bit. We feel sports rather than think about sports.
It becomes an expectation. A college sports question again. The trend, which was seemingly well developed before COVID hit, toward what do you think will happen, I guess, to the economics of college sports if NCAA moves forward in their permitting payments to players? I mean, will that how will that affect the sport and the industry?
So, first of all, I would phrase that completely different. It's not the NCAA that is being permitted to pay players. It's the NCAA finally being forced to allow players to earn money.
There we go.
The NCAA has tried forever. When economists talk about cartels, this is businesses that come together to stifle competition. We talk about OPEC every once in a while as being fairly successful for a somewhat long period of time. We talk about De Beers, which is the big diamond cartel that has successfully made all of us think that diamonds are forever, and of course they're a girl's best friend, and talk about and have gotten in our head. But when we talk about the single most successful cartel in history, a lot of us believe it's the NCAA. Literally thousands of institutions all coming together and agreeing not to pay any of their workers, and being able to get away with it, which is amazing. what's really going to become interesting in the fall, and this is the one huge legal, ethical issue that's going to come up, is what happens if Ohio State is not in session for in-person classes and does not allow students to live on campus next fall, but then also thinks that it's going to play college football, requiring football players to live on campus for the fall. This kind of gives lie to the whole idea that a football player at Ohio State, excuse me, Rob, the Ohio State, is a student athlete. None of the other students on the campus, none of the other 40,000 students are permitted to live on campus, and they're certainly not required to live on campus, but now you have a student athlete who is being required to live on campus because they're a football player. That really pretty much exposes Ohio State and the rest of big-time college athletics as what they really are. These are employees who work for the college, who are engaged in making huge amounts of money, huge revenues for the college, but because of this massively successful cartel, have been unable to be paid. So that'll be a very interesting thing that happens as we move forward. The kind of one chink that, or the chink in the dike, the little break in the dike we are seeing is whether students can earn any money outside of their actual playing in their field. Let me just give you an example of kind of how crazy NCAA rules are. My daughter is an aspiring volleyball player. She's decent. I live here in Worcester. I go to a school that has a large number of basically semi-professional volleyball players who are in my class. And I said, you know what would be great? It would be great if I could spend a little bit of my money and give it to one of my students to have them give my daughter volleyball lessons. Illegal. That's crazy. If I ask a math student, a math major at Holy Cross, to tutor my child, of course they can do that. If I ask someone in music to give my child trumpet lessons, they can do that. I ask one of the students who's a volleyball player and basically semi-pro, right? They're getting a scholarship to play volleyball. That's illegal. They cannot take that money. Nor can I ask any of the coaches to do it either, because that's a recruiting violation.
Of course, at Holy Cross,
what a
we
terrible
really don't have
world where,
volleyball scholarships, right?
yeah, what a terrible world that a student with skills in something who is poor, because we're all poor college students, right? Who would be happy to make $20 an hour teaching my daughter to serve. They can't take the money because of the NCAA, and that's just a little athlete here at Holy Cross. This is not, Zion Williams.
This is probably should be our last question from the crowd. Rob is very busily, he's not writing a book there. He's answering some of these questions directly, which I appreciate. And I think he just answered the one I was going to quote, which is, will Holy Cross have sports without students on campus? And Rob, what did you tell that person?
Well, gee, I don't know, Mike. Maybe a trustee should answer that question.
Yeah, no, he shouldn't. But
so I guess what I would say is, of course, that's in the realm of possibility. I think you're talking, though, about a situation where the college has been forced to decide that a subset of the students can be on campus. Look, I'm talking to a lot of Holy Cross people, and I'm not trying to put it, again, we're not at that point of the decision. I'm not trying to put that out there. But if we did have to make that decision, that's hard, okay, because we're a 90% residential campus. And then, as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of forces and pressures of this group needs to be on campus, and this does for a variety of reasons. And athletics, you know what I mean, would be, of course, have a seat at that table too, because like a lot of things that we do, athletics is part of it. So is it possible? Yes. All right. But it's sort of like a third or fourth tier decision. I think number one for the college, and, Mike or somebody else can correct me if I'm wrong, is can we have kids safely back on campus? We've got a responsibility to protect their health. If so, is that the full lot? Is it some subset? And then we'll start making those kind of second and third order decisions right now. So I think that's kind of my sense of the situation. I do think it's possible, but again, it's so early to tell. Because I think the college is kind of rightfully waiting to see how kind of things might develop with testing and the prevalence of the virus. Does that sound reasonable to you, Mike?
The thing I'd add to that is that there are 26 or 27 varsity sports at Holy Cross, and I don't think Holy Cross is the type of place that would treat some sports different than others. So it adds to complications. And then the other point I'd make that I've heard in meetings I've been in, the leagues that we're in are very concerned about the student part of student athlete, and they really would reinforce what Rob said. I think the SEC and the Big Ten might have a different approach than the Patriot League. So,
although even some of the biggest time athletic programs themselves shut down this spring because of that exact issue. So, for example, what really may have been the final nail in the coffin about whether we were going to have March Madness behind closed doors was actually Duke University, the biggest and obviously most hated of all basketball programs in the country. But what Duke said is, we can't participate in March Madness because we have no students, no place for our student athletes to be, because our campus is shutting down. We're kicking all the students out. Our students are supposed to be student athletes. If all the students are gone, that means all of our athletes are gone. If our athletes can't stay on campus, we have no way to keep a team together, even though we expect a deep run into March Madness. So, it's not just, it's not just the Williams, the Amherst, the Holy Crosses who say, let's think about the students first and then the athletic questions on a second tier. Even Duke had that in their mind going into March.
I'll say something positive, having being an Ohio State person and I grew up in Columbus, so I sort of lived, what the football team means to that entire state, and I love it. I mean, it's a part of my life on fall Saturdays, but it's almost like if you had an investment profile and you had all of your eggs in one particular basket and you didn't diversify at all. I think the trouble for places like Ohio State and Michigan and like these kind of really well-known NCAA football factories and the like is that a lot of their own students and the people that support them have a difficult time imagining that. So the powers that be at a place like an OSU are in a different position than our trustees here at Holy Cross, because Holy Cross has a wide diversification of the things that we do. Look what's happening right now. Okay, we have 100+ graduates and friends of the institution on a Thursday night after I'm guessing you guys have worked or Zoomed all day, just like Victor and I did. All right, this is a pretty unique thing, and it speaks to how Holy Cross just has assets across everything, all right, as opposed to in a place like Ohio State, which I loved going to school there, but look, it is really difficult to imagine that place without the football team. And I think, I don't want to say it's perverting their decision, I think that's too strong a word, but it's certainly influencing the kind of decisions that these places make. So in a kind of a strange way, we are a smaller institution, and so we're more susceptible to kind of bumps in the road than a much bigger place. However, we don't have all of our eggs in this one basket where we feel compelled, we've got to have a football season this year. Otherwise, what are we without it?
Great. Well, very well put. We do have other assets, and I did want to. I appreciate everybody hanging in there. I did want to give Rob and Victor a chance to mention in one area of current events to show that it's not all about sports economics. You folks were called on a couple days ago as experts on the phenomena of looting and rioting in cities. I didn't know if you want to take a couple minutes to share what I heard from you the other day about that, just to show the diversity of your economic analysis.
Yeah, Victor, I think this might have been one of the first things we worked on, right? Which was trying to trace the economic recoveries post Hurricane Andrew in Miami. That would have been 1992, and comparing and contrasting that with the Rodney King riots out in Los Angeles, also 1992. the kind of the spark for that was, we're working on this. I want to say it would have been about 2006, because this would have been post Hurricane Katrina. And there's a lot of interest in sort of the economic development of New Orleans as we get 5 years after Katrina and 10. And so Victor had already kind of come from the sports world. I was more of a statistician, but it's a very similar process to say, look at a Super Bowl. We've got this economic activity, and then here's a Super Bowl. Let's try to look back in time and see how much money that brought. You can do the same thing with not so great events, which would include natural disasters. And so Victor and I were kind of surprised that this happened. This was coming up in the context of what's happening with the George Floyd and the unrest that's sort of happening there. And reporters had found that paper. And again, what we really study, I guess, we focus on sports, but we're economic impact people. All right. So an event happens, and what we're trying to do is tease it out. Sports is kind of fascinating because, at least to me, because you see sports leagues ask for public money on the basis that it will provide an economic return. And that's where we got them. All right. Because we could just look back in time and verify whether that was true or not. But there's nothing stopping kind of the same methods from investigating really any sort of large event, including the bad ones like what's going on right now.
Yeah, so we definitely earn our moniker of dismal economists, or the dismal scientists, when we study this. But what we found in the Rodney King case is there was about $1 billion of damage that initially happened during the riots. So that's a huge impact. Although it's a fraction the size of the impact that happened at Hurricane Andrew, about $30 billion at the time. The worst natural disaster that it hit the United States in terms of total dollars. But what we saw in Hurricane Andrew is what we were hoping for with COVID-19 is what's known as a V-shaped recession, where it was, the economic activity totally fell off the cliff in Miami during Hurricane Andrew, but then it roared back right after. And so, a year after Hurricane Andrew, you couldn't even tell, at least from the data, that the hurricane had been there. That was totally not the case with Rodney King. There was about $1 billion of initial damage, but economic activity was depressed in the areas affected by the riots for as much as a decade afterwards. The total amount of economic activity in those areas, as measured by taxable sales, fell by about $4 billion. So 4 times more than the original damage itself. And that's a real concern. And especially because, again, like we talked about, this isn't harm that's equally spread over the entire Los Angeles metropolitan area. It's focused in the places that are already depressed, already, again, disproportionately minority areas. So it's a real concern. Yes, we have these riots here and significant damage. The question is, how quickly do areas in Minneapolis, where of course I went to grad school, places in Boston, we had a very small amount of looting in Worcester on Monday night. How quickly do these areas bounce back after that? If these riots are anything like the Rodney King riots, we're in for a very, very long, slow, and painful recovery. And obviously, anything we do to speed that up is helpful. I would also point out that it's also a good warning that having a police system that people can trust is extremely important, because this sort of flashpoint, it's a tragedy that a person who may or may not be guilty of passing a legal $20 bill ends up both dying, but also causing what is likely to be hundreds of millions of dollars in economic harm. So in order to save society $20, we've cost society hundreds of millions, and that's obviously tragic.
Well, thanks for that current events tutorial there. It just shows the kind of breadth and complexity of our faculty at Holy Cross. And Rob said that we have a lot going on as alumni, but we really are lucky to have a lot going on in our faculty. And we hope to have more of these events. We're all getting better at this kind of webcasting, and I appreciate Victor and Rob volunteering to do this. Next week, I think Thursday noontime, we have an event where English department professor will be discussing Hamilton, the play. So keep your eyes on the alumni calendar. You'll see more of these events going forward. Again, thanks, Rob and Victor, and thank Kristen and the staff in the Alumni Relations Office for pulling this together. And thanks to all of you for hanging in there with us tonight. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.